So,
Okay.
okay, welcome everybody to HAO Colloquium by Vanessa Marcia. Vanessa Marcia earned her master's degree in artificial intelligence and vision at the Technical University of Cluj-Napoca in Romania, having studied computer science. Her research interests centered on the applications of machine learning in space sciences, with a preference towards physics, particularly visual representations of data. She has a strong passion for teaching and for sharing knowledge across various domains, always keen to learn more about the inner workings of different algorithms. Today, she will be speaking on Sunquake detection and machine learning approach.
Thank you. Shall we wait a few more minutes or shall I start?
You can start.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So today, as mentioned, I will be discussing about Sunquake detection using different machine learning approaches. To create a bit of overview, I will present a brief introduction on Sunquakes and what manual detection methods are available out there. I'll talk about data for a bit, namely, we'll see some strong and weaker sources, and we'll talk about data set. We'll also see what challenges of this data set comes with, and then I'll move on to providing a brief overview of what machine learning is, namely supervised versus unsupervised techniques, and try to present what neural networks are and how they function before I move on to my approach. Finally, I will end with the results and discuss some post-validation analysis that we have performed. So let's jump right in. Sunquakes are rarely occurring progressive circular waves that are observed on the photosphere. These are thought to be produced by solar flares, and there are several detection methods available, but to our knowledge, none of them are automatic. We see some examples of detection methods here. So there is time distance analysis, then there is the movie method, and lastly, helioseismic holography. We use the latter as a pre-processing step for creating our data set. Now, without machine learning, detection is often laborious. It needs the trained eye. Those very few people in the world who study sunquakes. Also, because the manifestation circumstances of sunquakes are not entirely known, we're not sure where and when to look. So that makes it a bit difficult. Also, the multiple methods I mentioned earlier rendered different results. With machine learning, we could reduce the manual work and we could apply it to each data point so that it would provide ongoing prediction, but we do need compute power. And also, machine learning does need to reach a level of trustworthiness with the community, which is not quite stable right now. Moving on to the data. Here we see an example of an acoustic emission map, so a map generated by the helioseismic holography method. And we can see the sunquake occurring in this green circle. So basically, it's defined by an increasing intensity of a small portion of pixels in this active region, which is the black part here. This is a strong source, so we can clearly see the sunquake appearing and disappearing. The presence of the sunquake is conditioned by having this lighting effect occur for at least 8 frames, so for 8 minutes. Now, I'll show you a more difficult example. This is a very weak source. So if you're not sure where to look, this is very hard to track, even with the naked eye, to see the occurrence, right? To create the data set that we apply machine learning on, we performed a selection using sunquake events from the solar cycles 23 and 24 catalogs. And we downloaded 3-hour intervals of data enveloping the sunquake and ended up with unique frames with 845 unique frames for the positive class, so frames that show the sunquake signature, and around 13,000 which don't. And then we split this data after combining it in 80-20% trained capitalization. So the data comes with a lot of challenges. As you've seen in the numbers, it's quite imbalanced. So on average, we have only 4% of all individual data samples as Sunquakes. Also, measure patterns vary either in positioning or in intensity, as you've also seen earlier. And lastly, we also have artifacts which come from the collaboration method. And I have some examples here. So right here on the left-hand side, we see sort of a vortex appearing that does last for at least 8 frames, which satisfies the Sunquake condition, but it's outside of the active region, which is here. So it's not a Sunquake. And then on the right-hand side, we see this is a complete failure of the holography method with its current parameters. So this data is completely unusable. I'll try to make a brief overview, as I was saying, on machine learning. And I hope you'll get something out of this. Now, with conventional learning, as we see on the left-hand side, we usually have data, and we have a set of functions or rules which we apply to get our outputs. With machine learning, we have to think a bit out of the box. So we have our data, and then we know our answers, and we try to teach the machine to deduce the rule by which to compute the outputs, so that we can use it at a later phase on new data to provide new answers. There are several types of machine learning. The two I wanted to emphasize here are the supervised and unsupervised ones. So for supervised learning, which we see on the left-hand side, this is very similar with how we learn in school. So we take tests, we get graded, and based on our responses, we get rewarded or penalized. This is also how the machine learning models that are supervised work, in the sense that there is a human operator in the back that knows the right answer and knows when to punish, so to speak, the model when it performs badly. On the other hand, unsupervised learning occurs when we have data, but we don't know what to do with it. We don't know what the output should be, even though we have a human operator. So to create a better idea about this, some examples of unsupervised learning include trend analysis or clustering algorithms and such. Now, great part of what machine learning is are neural networks. So I'll try to go through what neural networks are for a bit. First, a more general overview, and then in a bit more detail. So basically, neural network models are a sequence of mathematical functions, which have, as any mathematical function, a set of parameters, theta. And our input data, in our case, our regression power maps, goes through the neural network, which then produces an output class. For instance, in our scenario, whether the input image that we provided is or is not a Sunquake. Now, outputting just a class might not be very useful. Sometimes we would like to know with what confidence the model predicted a certain class. So we prefer to output probabilities. Okay, the model outputs probabilities, but and we end up with a class distribution for the we end up with a predicted class distribution, but at the same time, in order to be able to decide whether the model did well or not, we also need a true class distribution. So we need to know what is the true probability that an input sample xi is or is not a Sunquake. Now, earlier I oversimplified things for a bit. Actually, the neural network models oftentimes just output real number vectors, such as the one here. So it's quite hard to infer anything from a prediction that says, oh, there's a 0.4 chance that this is a Sunquake and a -2 chance that it's not a Sunquake. And for this reason, we would need a method to convert this vector of real numbers to normalize it down to, I don't know, an interval of 0, 1, so that we can further analyze predictions. And to do this, we can use an activation function such as softmax, which is basically a sigmoid. And it takes as input the real number vector that we see here and produces probability distribution between 0 and 1. And this is the sigmoid function. So basically, any input that goes in outputs of value between 0 and 1. Now, we understand how our models can provide probabilities, but we still don't know how they can learn. So the first step towards learning is computing a mean of error. And we do this with loss functions. So to go through the process again, we have our inputs, x. They go through our model, and they output some predictions. I call them white bread. We also have a human operator saying, okay, we also have the true outputs. And such, we can define a function, a loss function, a function of error, which takes as input the predicted output and the true output, and measures the error. To better understand how loss functions work, I'll go through a very commonly used machine learning loss, which is cross entropy loss. And this is basically defined as the negative sum of the true class probability for each class, dot product with the logarithm of the predicted class probability. So to better understand this, I'll show you two examples. In the first case, let's assume we feed our model with a picture of a sunquake. After some computation, the model predicts that the picture does not contain a sunquake with probability equals 1. So the true probability of the image being a sunquake is 1. The predicted probability of the image being a sunquake is 0. If we rewrite the loss with this new terminology, we end up with this. And if we inject the actual outputs that we got from the model and compute the loss, we end up with infinity. Clearly, the loss is maximal, so this is a proof that the model performed really badly. As another example, we feed another picture of a sunquake to our model. This time, the model correctly predicts that the input was a sunquake, the probability equals 1. And so we end up with a loss that is equal to 0 if we inject the output values. Here, the loss is minimal, and clearly the model did good. Now, we still haven't talked about learning. We just know how to measure the error. To better understand that, I will break down what is inside the black box model that I just shown for a bit. So basically, as I was saying earlier, the neural network is a sequence of mathematical functions. And they reside in these components that are called neurons, which are interconnected. So each such neuron is defined as a function that takes as input xi, its previous input for input layer input image. And it's defined as an activation function AI, which basically you can imagine it's any nonlinear function applied to wx plus b, where x is again the input, b is a bias vector constant, and w is what we call weight, namely the model parameters. So let's go through the process. We feed new data to our model. Then we compute node values for each of these neurons. Basically, we apply this function that I just mentioned for each of the nodes. We do this throughout the network. We end up with the output value, the prediction that I mentioned earlier. We calculate the error applying the loss function. And then from mathematical artifice, we can go back to the neural network, and similar to how gradient descent works, we take the derivative of the error with respect to each of the weights in our model. And we keep doing this for all the layers until we reach the beginning and update the weight by either increasing or decreasing them based on the result of this derivative, by also applying what is called in machine learning a chain. Again, after this is finished, we feed new data and we go through the process again and again and again and again until the weights are adjusted such that the loss or error is minimized. Okay, so now that I presented the overview on machine learning, I'll just move on to our approach. Just go through the whole process of our research. So in the beginning, we downloaded the program data from JSOC. We applied the holography method. to extract regression power maps for acoustic emission maps. We then took those movies and extracted 2D grayscale images, frame by frame, to construct the data set that we have published on Canvas. That's really available. And then we annotated our data set with regions that were manually set up by us. And then to be able to facilitate the learning of our machine learning models, we applied a set of augmentations to the input images at one time. So we went with two different approaches, the classic ones, which are geometric transforms, such as flips and rotations, and we also applied domain-specific transforms. And we will see that each of these ones here, I will show them later on, solved a particular problem. So it was more like solving a puzzle for each of these. After augmenting our data, we defined two categories of models. So first of all, we have a category of models called contrastive learning detection models, which are basically doing binary classification, very similar to what I've shown earlier. So they are predicting whether each singular frame is or is not a Sunquake. And then the second category of model, for the frames where we know there was a Sunquake, predicts the actual kernel or location of the Sunquake. Finally, we test, of course, our models, but we also use additional previously unseen data that we apply our models on, and we validate the detections using various techniques that I will show at the end. Okay, so I will be talking about the first component, binary classification one, which determines the positioning time of the Sunquake. And for this, we use supervised contrastive learning, mainly because it's really good at learning patterns from data and also it works well with imbalanced data. So the process behind contrastive learning, and I'll show a figure later on so that you can visualize it, is that we take the input image and we reduce its image size by applying a series of convolutional filters. And then with the help of the loss function behind supervised contrastive learning, we are able to produce similar distributions for same class samples within the model's latent space, so that the latent space is what produces those numerical vectors. By this, we can capture the contrast, hence contrastive learning, between samples that belong to opposing classes. Okay, we then end up with these vectors that need to be classified, to which we apply both deep learning and statistical classification methods to actually deduce the output probabilities. And here is an example of how it works. So on the left-hand side, on the top, we have, let's assume one input image that goes through the model, which is called an anchor, the reference point, and we see its class as Sunquake. So what happens? Whenever this image goes through our model, which is depicted as this blue ball here, we consider also an augmented version of it, so a transformation applied to this image, and also all other samples that are also positive, so that also contain a Sunquake. And we do the same for negative samples. And with the loss function, what happens is in time, through multiple iterations, the vectors that the model produces for each of these get aligned, or we'll see that they're more closely distributed for same class samples. To go a bit into the maths behind the loss function for supervised contrastive learning, this may seem slightly complicated as opposed to the cross entropy loss that I've shown earlier, but if we look at the right-hand side here, we actually see that this is basically another sigmoid function. So the difference is that we are just ignoring the reference, the anchor, the reference sample. So what we get here is the probability distribution that quantifies the measurement of similarity between samples that belong to the same class with respect to the relative scale of all combinations of samples. Finally, we just divide by the cardinality of the samples belonging to each corresponding class. Okay, so just applying contrastive learning was not necessarily enough. We didn't get a good training progress. Such, we had to employ additional techniques to facilitate learning. So the first one is SMOTE, which means synthetic minority oversampling technique. And this is used to just generate additional data points for the positive class. Then secondly, we added the custom transformations that I mentioned earlier to enhance the learning. And finally, we also had to combine SMOTE with loss weighting. So how this works is mathematically in the loss function definition, we update it so that we penalize the model less when it makes mistakes that involve the minority class. To have a look at how SMOTE works, it's very simple. We basically take all the samples that belong to the same class, and here they are depicted in different colors for two classes. And you can imagine we draw a line between these and we just generate new vectors that fall onto those lines. Okay, moving on to one part. So first, the first transform that we introduced had the same purpose as in general in computer vision. So usually in computer vision, we need to have the model be attentive to various parts of the image because, I don't know, if we are predicting an animal of the presence of a cat in a picture, it might occur in various positions in the image. So we would like to know to have the model be attentive to smaller parts of the image at once instead of looking at the whole thing. However, the standard method in computer vision is to just crop out various parts of the image, which, if we were to do it for our scenario, would mean that we would crop the Sunquake out, so the detection would be hindered. So that didn't make sense for our scenario, for which reason we thought of a different method that would achieve the same thing, but in a different manner. And we called it altered random erase. We basically just erase random blocks from the image. The count of blocks is randomized and also the sizes are randomized, but they're generally small so that we don't hinder the Sunquake. We will sometimes, but it's okay because we only apply this transform on subset of the data and we do reshuffle it each train iteration. So if it's lost once or twice, that's all right. Second transform that we applied, it's called Solar Low Pass Filter. So what this does is it enhances the signal for high intensity regions. So we see a good example here where the Sunquake signature was highly enhanced. And we see a bad example here where all of the noise outside of the AR is enhanced, which it shouldn't. And another bad example here where the artifact generated by the holography method is enhanced. So once again, it is important that we apply this only on subsets of the data and we reshuffle data. But when we introduce this transform, we saw significant improvements in the learning curve. Okay. The third one, I think, was the most impactful. So going back to our data set, we know we initially have movies, events, 3-hour movies. When inputting the images into our contrastive learning model that I just talked about, we are doing it one image at a time. So we lose all this movie information, the sequence information. So what we thought was to combine consecutive frames, 1 by 1, 3 by 3, so that the model can look at multiple timestamps at once. So let's say we combine frame 0, frame 1, and frame 2 into a single 3-channel image, and then that's what we pass on to the model. This transform, I'm saying it was the most important because it made our models be very sensitive towards predicting the exact beginning time and ending time of the Sunquake. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, we also applied the classic geometric transforms to support diversity. So we do have around 14,000 images, which is decent for computer vision, but we only have around 40 edited regions because we have 40 source movies. And so we don't have much diversity. Most of the pictures will look the same. And so by flipping or rotating them, the model gets to see something different each time. Moving on to predicting the kernel or the spatial component of the Sunquake. For this, we use object detection algorithm called faster RCNN. So similar to what I mentioned for contrastive learning, we take the image and we reduce its size by applying a series of convolutional layers. And then we identify multiple candidate object regions. So by object regions, I mean we get box coordinates for potential sunquakes. Then we crop out the respective regions from the original image and we resize them so that they're all the same size, and we classify them as sunquake or not. And as a means of error, we use the intersection over union between the predicted region and the region that we have manually annotated. Finally, we return those regions that we classified as sunquakes for further analysis. In terms of metrics, we use the classical machine learning metrics, but I will go through them with you as well. We use precision, recall, accuracy, and F1 score. So precision is used as a means to measure how correct our model is with respect to predicting positives, so to predicting sunquakes. So out of all the frames where the model predicted a sunquake frame, what is the percentage of which truly are sunquakes? Recall is a measure of coverage. So out of all the frames which truly are sunquakes, how many did the model correctly identify? So for instance, if we have 100 frames which are truly sunquakes and the model identifies 50, we have a 50% recall. Accuracy is similar to precision, so it measures the correctness of our model's outputs, but as opposed to precision, it does this for all frames, so both positives and negatives. So for all frames, how many did the model correctly predict? And lastly, F1 score measured. This is very similar to precision and recall, so it's basically the harmonic mean between precision and recall. Moving on to results, we created or set up two ensemble models. By ensemble, I mean we combined the contrastive learning for detecting the timestamps and the object detection for detecting the kernels. And the only difference between the two models is how we shuffled the data between the train set and the test set. So for the first model, there is no overlap between same event frames that train and validation sets. So this means that all the active regions that are present in the train set are definitely not present in the validation set. So this makes this data set very trustworthy in terms of validation. If we look at the metrics, we have, I'm going to look at the option with small because it's clearly better. We have quite a high precision, so around 84%. This means that our model was good at, whenever our model did predict a sunquake frame, it was really good at it. However, we see a very small recall. This is terrible. In machine learning metrics, this is terrible, 54. However, when we looked at the actual predictions of our model, because we were intrigued by the fact that the precision is so high, so if it's so good at predicting a sunquake correctly, why does it not predict all the sunquakes? So when we looked at the actual predictions, we noticed that the model was very good at predicting the beginning frame and the ending frame of the sunquake, so the transitions. And this only occurred after applying the time-based mixing transformation that I mentioned earlier. F1 score is, as I was saying earlier, a mix between precision and recall. So I will go through it again. And accuracy is definitely not something to take into account because our data set is very imbalanced. So because we have so many negative samples that it predicts correctly as negative, it of course will have high values regardless. So it's not necessarily a metric that we should pay attention to. For the second model, as I mentioned earlier, we have a shuffle bias. So we have same event frames shuffled between the train and validation set. It's not the same image, but we might have frame 10 from event 1 in the train set and frame 11 from event 1 in the test set. So the model has seen that active region before. It might already know where the sunquake is. This model is going to be good at predicting all sunquake frames, but once again, it's not something that we want to rely on. So for any further validations, we used the first model. So after testing and validating our ensemble model, we selected 4 previously unseen data cubes that we applied both our models. So we applied contrastive learning to predict the timing of sunquakes, and for those frames where this model predicted a sunquake, we also applied the second model to predict the location of the kernel. Based on this application, we ended up with 6 candidate events. So in the 4 data cubes, which are 3-hour movies, we found 6 sunquakes. But we had to discard 4 because they didn't maintain either the duration requirement, so they didn't maintain a position for 8 frames, or the position was slightly shifting, so we had to discard. So we ended up with 2 events that we have further analyzed, which were potential sunquakes, and we used AIA, RESI, and statistical analysis to take a look at these. So for the first event, what we see here are frames where the first model, the contrastive learning one, predicted the presence of a sunquake. And in the CN box, we see the location predicted by the second model, the object detection one. And we can see that this green box, CN box, overlaps with the foot point of the flaring loop in the AIA 94 channel at the exact location. And also by looking at RESI here, we see high energy X-ray emissions, which are correlated to C1 class flare.
I think Steve talked to Greg about it.
Now, for the second event, we applied the same techniques. This was a bit more strong, so we looked at AIA 304 channel. And once again, we can see the same foot point of the flaring loop overlapping with the detections of our model. And we also see the high energy X-ray emissions. Now, moving on to more statistics. We'll go through each of these plots here. So for the 2 events, 30 December, 8th of May, we have here the background normalized upsync emission power maps in the 5 to 7 millihertz band. And with purple, we have the 9 pixel average, respectively 8 for the bottom one. And with blue, we have 20 and 25 pixel average. And we can see the signal is more intense. And if we plot the signal over time, over the entire event duration of 3 hours, we can see that the signal to noise ratio for the sunquake that we detected maintains detection levels above 3 sigma, which is the requirement, but it's actually 4 sigma for both scenarios. So this confirms our detections are correct. And moreover, if we look even more at the 24-hour interval, we see that the statistical significance increases even more. So we see 5 sigma signal to noise ratio for both scenarios, and it's also the most visible shift over the entire day. So to summarize, with the statistical analysis and with what I've previously shown, we can correlate the sunquakes that our models detected with class C1 flares. So very, very low upsync emission sources. Okay, so this was it. I went through it a bit fast. I'll lift this up, and if you have any questions.
Thank you.
I have a comment that's very relevant. DC1 type of events are the lowest ever detected sunquakes in history. So these are under your normal manual eye sensitivity.
yeah, so just by looking at the acoustic emission maps, we couldn't see them with the naked eye. Only the statistical analysis.
So it sounds like the observations you're using to either train it or find them in the final place are something called holography. So I'm not
Yeah.
really familiar with that. Can you like give us a little bit of a
Can
What is
you do it better than me? I can show you how it looks like. And I don't know what's the process behind it, so how you obtain those maps.
well,
But I know
what are the observations from in the first place? What
it's
instrument?
Dopplergrams, and then yeah, go ahead, please.
You are correct. These are HMI Dopplergrams
For MRI.
or MDI for solar cycle 23 that are processed using the holography method developed by Charlie Lindsay. So it basically makes a pupil and then looks for wave propagations in frequency bands. And then you can associate those wave propagations to different heights above or below the photosphere. So normally the 5 to 7 millihertz band is the most common waves that appear around at photosphere at the height of the photosphere. So it's
And that's waves moving vertically.
horizontally.
Okay.
Are those gravity waves?
No, just acoustic waves through
These
the.
are just acoustic waves that are usually generated and enhanced during powerful flares. So there's multiple ways of doing it. Either you would say that you have a very outward release of tension for a flare, or you might have a proton beam that smacks down the photosphere and then generates a wave as it dissipates. These are the two main scenarios for getting these types of sunquakes. This is basically a more refined version than just taking the K omega diagram and looking for wave propagations. So it does this holographic filtering of heights, and it technically the claim is that it's more sensible than just looking at the raw Dopplergrams. But the information is encoded in the Dopplergrams in some more obfuscated way.
Yeah, our initial dream after this research was to just try to do the same thing directly on Dopplergrams and some other the rest. I'll see during my PhD. maybe.
So like, if you're looking at the active region, so generally whenever you look at the sunspot, there are waves in there, which are like kind of like a symmetric and being outward propagating and stuff. When you do look at these sunquakes, it has very simplistic nature. So can your algorithm differentiate if it is being looking at a proper sunquake, or it is just looking at any of the wave which is being propagating out of sunspot or active region?
So normally the sunquake, so if you show one with where the shadow is seen better, so the sunquake inhibits waves in this frequency. So basically you see the active region inhibits waves at this frequency. So if you look, so that's why you can see the shadow of the active region as opposed to the quiet sun where these things just go randomly everywhere.
Okay.
And that's why it's way easier to identify such events in active region. It's also because usually flares cause them, but there's not a
because like
one-to-one association.
just by looking at it, it gives an impression like I'm looking at these umbral flashes, which are kind of very much. If you look at any of these sunspot movies, you can see these kind of features which have been going out, like flashing features, which is a shock kind of a scenario. So that is what I was being. Yeah. So.
No,
No.
that's just an artifact.
I know, but I
from
was
the
just curious.
holography.
Okay. Interesting.
There's no one-to-one. People have been trying to do this association with umbral flashes, but it seems they're quite distinct.
Okay.
So it's not, you don't, if you look for an umbral flash, you usually don't see it, but sometimes people have seen it. But I'm not sure there's a straight answer of whether they're connected or not. And it might have just been a coincidence. It might have just been a particular situation where these things are at the same spatial location and temporal time.
Okay,
So
I have another, a bit more naive question. What comes first, sunquakes or flare?
it depends on what type of trigger mechanism you like for sunquakes. Do you like the impulsive energy release below the surface or at the surface, or do you like a proton beam hitting the atmosphere? And both of them have been associated to sunquakes.
Yeah.
So the problem is it's a case by case type of thing, because sunquakes can come from either of these two.
So generally, we don't have a consensus, or we do have a kind of a consensus in the sunquake research.
I think both of the phenomena are valid, and it's a one you can only make that association per event.
Okay.
If you detect the sign of the proton beam hitting the lower atmosphere, then the sunquake is an after effect of maybe a flare that was triggered at higher heights. If you have a submerged source, so if you have some flux buildup, maybe even under the photosphere, then the sunquake is a direct response of that energy release. So
But even when you have
at the
this,
same time with the flare.
the energetic beam which is going down, when it hits the photosphere, it generally makes these high temperature post-flare kernels. Like not always you will see having these quake kind of behavior.
Yeah.
So but in some cases it does make these quake hippo kind of a thing, which is kind of so why?
The exact magnetic configuration of this active region is
Okay.
also important. Sometimes you need a clear path for the energy to get dumped all the way down to the photosphere. And in some cases, you have very strong flares with no sunquakes. And then you have sunquakes that are associated with very weak flares. So I don't think there's a clear correlation between.
There's more scope for.
There's a lot of variables that vary in different ways and may affect what we see.
Okay. Thank you.
Related to this, are there any sunquakes which are not associated with flares at all?
So far, most of the methods look at flares and then go and look for sunquakes.
But now you have a
Now we
very
have-
sensitive
yeah.
method. So
Now we
if
have
you
a-
just scan as much sun as you can scan, it would be interesting to see if there are some events people normally miss because they don't know
Yeah.
for that.
I don't know what the status is. Juan Carlos and Charlie were working on submerged sources. So you might see very submerged sunquakes from something happening below the surface that doesn't result in a flare. But I'm not sure if the publication was finalized by now or not. So it's a active region of people trying to figure it out. So if you go on higher energy, the higher energy bands you go, technically you see the source more low. The source is located lower and lower below the surface. And in those cases, I know there have been reports of seeing sunquake activity without actually seeing a surface flare. But I don't know if that can be said about, it's what Dana said, the method of identifying sunquakes relies on flares. So you only look for them the other way around. But what we did was just look at some data cubes that I got them wrong when I created them, and I wasn't looking at the correct dates of the active region. So there was nothing happening in those data cubes in terms of large scale flares. But then it proved out they were perfect test cases for the more final models. And we found these small C1 flares there, which was quite astounding.
Yeah, it's been a journey.
Yeah.
These phenomena tend to last for a few frames, not a single frame, right?
Yes, and that's a problem that comes directly from the holography. So if it doesn't last at least 7 frames, it needs to be discarded because then it can be noise. So you need a big enough temporal sample to sample the waves at that frequency. And in HMI cadence is at least 7 frames.
Yeah.
So do you think an architecture that takes into account the temporal change of your data? It's gonna be maybe the next step.
This is what the model, you see.
No, sorry, can you ask again?
But like, do you ingest single frames at a time, or you?
Single frames, 3 frames at a time.
Okay.
Combination of 3. We wanted to do more, but we had to re-implement all the augmentation methods because we couldn't use default ones on more multi-channel images more than 3. But yeah, this would have been our next step if we hadn't gotten good results with the 3
Mhm.
step combination.
So our custom implementation took a color mapping, and it was an RGB type of mapping. And instead of using it in color space and just having RGB frames and take them as a clump to feed them to the training, we modified it so it takes a temporal sequence of 3 frames. And that's why the model instantly became very sensible. So it's not as good as finding an individual frame where the sunquake occurs. It's good at finding the 2 edges, when a sunquake starts and when a sunquake ends. That's where the contrastive.
It's the shift in it seems that the convolution, when you apply the convolutions to the 3 channels in parallel, that's it shift really well.
Online people, please unmute and ask your question if you have. I have a quick question. You mentioned about 2 models, model 1 and model 2. What is the basic difference? Is it the difference in terms of machine learning technique, or is there any difference in the physics of the model?
It's a difference in what it was trained on. So the first one, we take, let's say we have 40 events, 3-hour intervals. We take 30 of those and use them for the training set, and the remaining 10 we use for the testing set. So in the testing set, the model sees only completely new active regions. For the second model, which is as a shuffle bias, we completely randomize all of them between the train and tests.
Other questions? I not from the. Okay, if not, let's thank our speaker for a very nice talk.
So I can build trust. Trust.